They said Area 6 was just storage. A few old hangars scattered across the Nevada desert, housing nothing more than decommissioned aircraft and surplus equipment. Nothing classified. Nothing important. Just another forgotten corner of the military-industrial complex, left to gather dust under the relentless desert sun. But on a cold February night in 2018, Officer Ray Delaney saw something that didn't belong in any storage facility, and made the critical mistake of reporting it. Ray was a contract security officer, one of dozens stationed around the sprawling perimeter of Groom Lake, Nevada. The area most people know as Area 51. But Ray wasn't assigned to the famous facilities that conspiracy theorists obsess over. His beat was different. Quieter. More mundane. His job was deceptively simple: watch the designated sector, report any unusual activity, and above all else, don't ask questions about what you might see. Area 6 was considered the least significant of all the numbered sectors surrounding the main facility. While Area 51 housed the cutting-edge aerospace research that captured public imagination, Area 6 was where things went to be forgotten. Outdated radar equipment. Mothballed prototype aircraft that never made it past initial testing. Storage containers filled with spare parts for aircraft that had been retired decades ago. The kind of place where careers went to die, where security officers were assigned when the government wanted them to have something to do but nothing important to protect. He wasn't the curious type by nature. Ray Delaney was a man of few words, someone who understood the value of keeping his head down and doing his job. A Gulf War veteran with 23 years of military and security experience under his belt. He'd seen enough in his lifetime to know that some questions were better left unasked, some doors better left unopened. He'd served in Baghdad during the surge, witnessed things that never made it into official reports, learned early that survival often depended on selective blindness and strategic ignorance. The government paid him well to patrol a seemingly quiet desert road under a starless sky, and that suited him just fine. At 52, Ray wasn't looking for adventure or excitement. He'd had enough of both to last several lifetimes. What he wanted was steady work, decent benefits, and the kind of predictable routine that allowed him to sleep soundly during daylight hours. The isolation of the desert posting actually appealed to him: no office politics, no complicated interpersonal dynamics, just him, the night sky, and the endless expanse of Nevada wilderness. For 3 years, Ray had walked the same route, driven the same patrol circuit, filed the same uneventful reports. Night after night, his logs read like a meditation on emptiness: no unusual activity observed. Perimeter secure. All systems normal. The desert was predictable in its silence, broken only by the occasional coyote pack calling across the valley or the distant hum of aircraft from the main facility miles away. He'd learned to distinguish between the sounds of different aircraft types, could identify whether the late-night flights were transport planes, experimental jets, or the occasional helicopter ferrying personnel to classified locations. Ray knew the rhythm of the place. He understood when to expect supply convoys, when shift changes occurred at distant facilities, even when the automated systems would cycle through their diagnostic routines. This knowledge made him good at his job, good enough that his supervisors rarely bothered to check on him, trusting his decades of experience to keep Area 6 secure without micromanagement. But on February 17th, at exactly 2:13 a.m., everything changed. Ray was completing his standard perimeter walk, following the chain-link fence that separated Area 6 from the surrounding Bureau of Land Management territory, when he saw lights cutting through the darkness above the facility. But these weren't the familiar navigation lights of military aircraft he'd grown accustomed to recognizing. These weren't the strobing patterns of experimental drones being tested in the dead of night. What Ray witnessed defied every category in his mental catalog of aerial phenomena. A massive black triangle, easily the size of a football field, hovered silently above Hangar 3 of Area 6. The craft appeared to be constructed from some kind of matte black material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making its edges difficult to distinguish against the star-filled sky. Only the arrangement of lights on its underside made the full scope of the object visible, a perfect geometric pattern of what appeared to be white and blue illumination, pulsing in sequence like some kind of technological heartbeat. The craft made no noise whatsoever, no rotor wash, no jet engine whine, no vibration that he could feel even standing several hundred yards away. In his years of military service, Ray had been around every type of aircraft in the American arsenal. He knew the distinctive sound signatures of everything from stealth bombers to experimental VTOL prototypes. This thing produced absolutely no acoustic signature at all, as if it were somehow isolated from the physical laws that govern conventional flight. It just floated there, as if the laws of physics had decided to take a coffee break. The underside of the triangle was illuminated by a series of lights arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, pulsing with an intensity that seemed to bend the very air around them. Ray could see heat distortion rippling outward from the craft, despite the cold February air that had his breath forming visible clouds just moments before. Ray stood frozen for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. His training kicked in, muscle memory overriding the shock and disbelief flooding his system. This was exactly the kind of unusual activity he was paid to report. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, fingers fumbling slightly with the familiar weight of the device as he tried to process what his eyes were telling him. Standard protocol was clear: unusual aerial phenomena were to be reported immediately to base command, regardless of their apparent origin or nature. "Base, this is Delaney," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We have an unidentified," that's as far as he got before his world turned upside down. The radio cut out mid-transmission, replaced by a harsh burst of static that seemed to echo across the empty desert. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that felt heavier than the darkness surrounding him. Even the normal background noise of the desert, the distant hum of electrical equipment, the whisper of wind through the fence line, the subtle electronic chirping of his various monitoring devices, everything had gone completely quiet, as if someone had pressed a cosmic mute button. And the lights above Hangar 3, they blinked twice in what almost seemed like acknowledgement of his attempted communication, a deliberate sequence that felt somehow intelligent, purposeful, and then vanished entirely, as if the massive craft had simply winked out of existence. Not moved away. Not ascended into the sky. Just gone, leaving behind only the lingering smell of ozone and the persistent feeling that the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few seconds. Ray stood alone in the desert, staring up at empty sky, wondering if he'd imagined the entire encounter. But the afterimage burned into his retinas told him otherwise. The smell of ozone lingering in the air told him otherwise. The complete failure of his radio equipment, and now he noticed, his cell phone, his GPS unit, and even his digital watch, told him otherwise. Everything electronic within a 50-foot radius of his position had been completely disabled. He spent the remainder of his shift in a daze, completing his patrol route on autopilot while his mind raced through possible explanations. Experimental aircraft using some kind of advanced stealth technology. Atmospheric phenomenon caused by unusual weather patterns. Mass hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. None of them fit what he'd witnessed. None of them explained the precise timing of the equipment failures or the geometric perfection of those lights. None of them accounted for the complete absence of any conventional flight characteristics. Ray had seen experimental aircraft before during his years at various military installations. He'd witnessed test flights of prototypes that wouldn't be acknowledged publicly for decades. But this was something entirely different. This was technology that operated according to principles he couldn't begin to understand, deployed by someone with resources and capabilities that dwarfed anything in the acknowledged military arsenal. Ray submitted a detailed written report later that morning, documenting everything he'd observed with the methodical precision that had served him well throughout his military career. Time stamps, weather conditions, equipment status, visual descriptions, even his own physical and psychological state during and after the encounter, everything a proper incident report should contain. He filed it through official channels, following the same procedures he'd used hundreds of times before for routine security matters, and went home to his small apartment outside Las Vegas. He expected follow-up questions within days. Debriefings with intelligence personnel. Maybe even commendation for his thoroughness and professionalism in handling an unprecedented situation. What he got instead was a silence that stretched on for 48 increasingly uncomfortable hours. Instead, 2 days later, he received new orders that arrived via courier rather than through normal military channels. Reassignment to a remote weather monitoring station in Fairbanks, Alaska, effective immediately. No explanation provided. No discussion offered. No acknowledgement of his years of exemplary service at Groom Lake. Just a one-way ticket to the frozen wasteland and a new assignment monitoring wind patterns and atmospheric conditions for the National Weather Service, a job that would effectively end his security career and isolate him thousands of miles from anyone who might be interested in what he'd witnessed. His original report. Gone from the system as if it had never existed. When Ray tried to access the incident database using his standard credentials, he found no record of his filing, no trace of the documentation he'd spent hours carefully preparing. His security clearance. Revoked without explanation or due process, cutting off his access to the very systems he'd been trusted with for over 2 decades. His access badge to the facility where he'd worked for 3 years. Deactivated while he slept, leaving him locked out of a life he'd built one quiet night shift at a time. The efficiency of the erasure was almost as unsettling as the original encounter. Someone with significant resources and authority had moved very quickly to contain what Ray had witnessed, suggesting that his experience wasn't entirely unprecedented. This felt like a well-practiced routine, a standard operating procedure for dealing with witnesses to phenomena that weren't supposed to exist. Desperate for answers, Ray called Marcus Webb, a former colleague who transferred to a different facility 6 months earlier. Marcus had been a friend, someone Ray trusted, someone who might be able to shed light on what was happening to his career and his life. Marcus was former Air Force intelligence, someone who understood how the system worked, someone who might have contacts capable of explaining why Ray's life was being systematically dismantled. The conversation was brief and chilling. Marcus answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting the call. "Ray," Marcus said after a long pause, his voice tight with something that sounded like fear. "I can't talk about this over the phone. Hell, I shouldn't be talking about this at all. But I'm going to give you one piece of advice, and you better listen carefully, don't ever mention that night again. Not to anyone. Not ever. Some doors, once you open them, you can't close again. Some things, once you see them, make you a liability." The line went dead, leaving Ray with more questions than answers and the growing realization that he'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple security incident. Marcus Webb, a man who'd served in combat zones and classified operations around the world, had sounded genuinely terrified. And if Marcus was scared, Ray knew he should be absolutely terrified. Since then, Officer Ray Delaney has systematically disappeared from public records. His social media accounts vanished overnight, not deactivated but completely erased as if they'd never existed. His apartment lease was terminated by his landlord, who claimed to have no forwarding address and seemed nervous when asked about his former tenant. His military service records became classified at a level that makes them inaccessible to standard background checks, even for employment purposes. His family members, when contacted by researchers years later, claim no knowledge of his current whereabouts and refuse to discuss his time at Groom Lake. His ex-wife, reached at her home in Phoenix, hung up immediately upon hearing his name mentioned. His brother, a mechanic in Tucson, claimed never to have heard of anyone named Ray Delaney despite public records showing they'd grown up in the same household. The systematic nature of the silence suggested coordination at the highest levels of government. The man who spent 23 years serving his country, who did nothing more than his job on a cold February night, has been erased as thoroughly as if he never existed. The only trace that remains of Officer Ray Delaney and his encounter is a single document that somehow escaped the systematic purge of evidence, perhaps overlooked in the rush to contain the situation, perhaps deliberately preserved by someone with a conscience who wanted the truth to survive. All that's left is a scanned copy of the original shift log from February 17, 2018, timestamped 2:13 a.m. A routine form that should have been filed and forgotten, now preserved as the only proof that something extraordinary happened in the desert that night. The document surfaced 3 years later on a whistleblower website, authenticated by handwriting experts and verified through forensic analysis of the paper and ink used. In the margin, barely legible in Ray's careful handwriting, a single note that continues to haunt researchers and conspiracy theorists alike: not a drone. Not ours. For words that raise 1,000 questions. For words that cost a good man everything he'd built. For words that suggest we are not alone, and that some people will do anything to keep that secret buried in the Nevada desert, protected by silence, intimidation, and the systematic elimination of anyone who gets too close to the truth.